I do want to acknowledge a bit, just for a second, what has been acknowledged, but I'm going to pile on. Dimitri, Maureen, Sarah, and the entire Silverado team for organizing this conference in such a fabulous place, but more importantly, enticing leaders from the public sector and the private sector for this conversation. And it's a conversation that is somewhat scary, world on the brink, but it's a conversation that you all have dedicated your work, your time, and your passion to finding solutions. So with the illustrious panel today, I'm going to quickly introduce them, and then I'm going to sort of level set what we've already heard, what we've seen, and what we're going to try to accomplish a little bit today. So I'm going to have to put my glasses on for this. I apologize. We have, again, like I said, an illustrious panel today, which is just a sampling of the leaders in the audience. Sushan Demirjarian, did I get it? Demirjarian? Okay. I practiced. Assistant USTR, so Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Small Business, Market Access, and Industrial Competitiveness in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. And I think you said this, I think you have more words in your title than on your staff, and I just counted, you do. We have Narayan Subramanian. Did I get that right? Okay. Advisor to the Secretary of the Department of Energy for Clean Energy Projects and Supply Chains, and as I learned yesterday, and talking a bit more to Narayan, the fixer at the Department of Energy, so everybody take note. Then we have the CEO and co-founder of Altana Technologies, Evan Smith, and Jasper Jung, General Motors, Executive Director of Global Strategic Initiatives. I am very excited to hear from all of you, but as I said, I want to repeat some of the things that we've heard in the past couple of days. I recognize that the bar's not open yet, but I'm going to recite some statistics that I think is important for us to really, to our core, understand before we can talk about the positive that's being done and what else needs to be done. I'm going to say a pun right now. I just realized it. We've dug ourselves a hole. And we need to dig ourselves out of this hole. And there are many pockets in the government and in the private sector that are doing that. But the hole exists, and it is a pretty deep one right now. China controls 80 to 90%, depending on which mineral, rare earth element, critical technology we're talking about. What do you mean by control? They control our access to. If they want to shut it off, they can. In many instances, it's not in their best interest to. But it might be. They want to maintain that control. They want to maintain that dominance. Why do we care? Do we want to be dominant? I don't think that's what we're striving for. But I do think what we're striving for is to maintain our economic flexibility and our economic freedoms, our market-based economies. That's really what's at stake. That's what's on the brink, quite honestly. And what we're trying to do is figure out solutions. And we can all say, okay, yeah, that's well and good. We have not had a new mine, with the exception of a small copper mine, I think in Arizona, in the last several decades. We continue to see mines being denied. Okay, recognize that. We'll talk about solutions in a second. We recognize that China can cut off and has shown us that they can cut off gallium, germanium, and graphite. Okay, that's scary. We're on the brink. What are we doing about that? Well, not to be critical, but we continue to talk about things and ways we want to move forward, but we're looking backwards. We're talking about industrial policy and industrial strategy. I don't know about you, but when I hear that, I think of smokestacks. We need to move forward. China certainly is. China wants to maintain their control and dominance. We have, and I'm going to channel my husband right now. Mike is the internal optimist. I am not. Mike will say to me, Christy, the United States has been here before. We have faced more difficult challenges previously. American innovation, ingenuity, and our sheer grit have gotten us to move forward. We work together. I respond, I retort a little bit, and I say, yeah, but we had leaders. You guys are all leaders. They're leaders up here today. We need to focus our American innovation. We need to focus our American entrepreneurship to tackle these problems. And I think with you all being here today, with the book that's being written, we are doing that. And I want to highlight some of the ways in which we're doing that. I was inspired yesterday listening to Evan and saying, hey, we need to step back. We need to realign, reframe. It's not just the supply chains. It's value chains. It's the ecosystems of our manufacturing, our technology systems, and supply chains. It's an entire value chain. We need to realign the way we're thinking around that. We need to realign our supply chains to the way we implement them, the way we use technology to see upstream and downstream, the way we incentivize them, the way we regulate them, and the way we partner around them. We can do that. We've shown we can do that, and we know how to do that. These individuals all have examples of how to do that. Not that I'm putting pressure on any of you today. But I think it's time that we channel our American spirit and innovation. We focus it together. As Sarah pointed out, I've been running a global supply chain task force since literally the world shut down in March of 2020. And I say, we need more people in our merry band. We need more people in our rowboat rowing in the same direction. So to our illustrious panel, we're gonna play softball to start the morning. Bar's not open, let's play softball. First question, and Narayan, I'm gonna ask you first because you're sitting next to me. I was gonna go to Jasper, but point to or highlight something you're doing in your organization, your company, your agency, that you're proud of, that is innovative, or something you wish you could be doing.
Thank you, Christy, and thanks to Silverado for hosting this incredible series of conversations. So to answer Christy's question, I could talk about the whole suite of policies that the Department of Energy is implementing under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act. We're talking about billions and billions of dollars going into supply chains across the clean energy sector. But we've talked a lot about battery supply chains the last couple of days. You mentioned graphite just now. It came up in the last panel. So just focusing on that. I think it's a very, very good example of just the kind of comprehensive approach that the federal government, and specifically DOE, has taken. So under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, emphasis Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Department of Energy got $6 billion of grant authority for battery material processing and manufacturing. And so as part of that program, the Department of Energy selected two synthetic graphite companies, Novonix and Innovian, and recognizing that this is a critical part of the supply chain that we need to solve. We need to definitely build up domestic capacity. But along the way, we also, the Loan Programs Office got additional loan authority through the Inflation Reduction Act, and a little thing that happened in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law was expanding the eligibility for critical minerals projects for the Loan Programs Office. So about 2 years ago, the Loan Programs Office provided a conditional commitment to Sierra in Louisiana, which is a natural graphite processing project. And so just in graphite, you see the Department of Energy kind of investing in synthetic and natural graphite processing projects. In the last panel, the question came up, what are we doing in terms of R&D, in terms of thinking about ways of thinking about future supply chains? So in that same $6 billion grant program I mentioned to you, the Office of Manufacturing and Energy Supply Chains at DOE also provided grants to two companies, synthetic anode companies, or silicon anode companies based in Washington State, Group 14 and CLED Nanotechnologies. So these are basically alternatives to graphite anodes that the Department of Energy is also investing in. And then if you take a step back outside of DOE, DFC, just about a year ago, put money into a graphite project in Mozambique, which the off-taker for that is also the company that the Loan Programs Office is funding in the natural graphite project. So that just goes to show, if there's industrial policy happening anywhere, I would say, in the government right now. It's really in the battery supply chain. You see this across the board between the grant programs, the loan programs, and not to mention also the tax credits. The 45X tax credit is giving companies a production credit for processing critical minerals, for creating manufacturing cathodes and anodes, for manufacturing battery cells and packs and whatnot. So this is happening across the board. And I keep saying this in conversations, like if you squint hard enough, you really start seeing all the pieces fit together. So that's just one example I would give of what's really exciting to me that DOE is part of right now.
Excellent, thank you. And I will say, the obvious, Department of Energy, Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, you are all doing some extraordinary things to move us forward. And I will, one of your colleagues has told me, this is not your mother's or your grandmother's Department of Energy anymore. Well, it can't be. Jasper, so talk to us about General Motors.
Sure.
Not just in general, but specific.
We can talk a bit about GM, but we can also, building on a lot of the things around supply chains here, and I also want to add my thanks and appreciation to Maureen, to Sarah, to Dimitri, and all the folks at Silverado. This is our first year here, and it's been a fascinating few days of conversations. But I think to pick up on your question, I'm going to follow your sage words and Evan's advice just in terms of taking a step back and looking at the entire ecosystem. And I think when we look at the entire EV and battery value chain, I think that's what's really setting GM apart in terms of our thinking and our approach. We'd like to call it kind of looking holistically from rock to road at this point. And what are we doing both upstream and downstream to vertically integrate and to diversify our supply chains upstream, but making sure that we are passing along that value, that we are creating both through risk mitigation, cost reduction, to our customers, and really kind of taking that industry transition at scale. A lot of that has to do with new ways of thinking, new approaches, new investments, new partners. It was great to see Jim here yesterday from MP Materials, a fantastic partner for us on rare earths and magnets. We were joking a couple years ago internally. I mean, we're an automotive company now looking at investing in mines and learning all about processing, how to get battery-grade lithium hydroxide, nickel sulfates, and things. I have a periodic table now at my desk right next to my product portfolio, and I feel like I got into this line of work because I was really bad at science. But let this be a lesson to all your kids out there. You can't avoid it. Math and science are the way to go. But I think, and we can have a whole conversation about that another time. But I think that also kind of points to how we're approaching this internally. We recognize following COVID, the semiconductor crisis, that we needed to think about our resilience strategy when it came to the EV and battery supply chain. We had to think about how are we sourcing these materials, how are we diversifying, how are we not only just mitigating kind of market factors like cost, concentration risks, things like that, but new risks around geopolitics, sustainability, reporting, and transparency. A lot of the expectations and the regulations, not just here in the US, but worldwide, as we continue to go down that path. So we think about, just in our strategy, we have four real kind of key pillars to that. It's not just about the cost competitiveness, it's about the sustainability of the sourcing, both from an environmental, from a social standpoint, but just also a long-term strategy. It's about the security, of course, access and availability and certainty of supply going forward. And Grant mentioned this at the end of his comments in the last session, and I wanted to reiterate the scalability. We are going to make investments. We're going to look at projects, both established ones and junior ones, but scalability at the end of the day is critical in order to be able to bring that to market and to really kind of support the strategy that we're trying to do. And it's really interesting just in terms of our approach, in terms of advancing that strategy. We have an internal cross-functional team now. I probably spend more time on the policy side with our procurement and corporate development and finance and legal folks than I do with my own policy team. And I think that's a reflection of how fast we want to be and all the inputs that are required to move at speed and all the risks that we have to deal with. So we're really kind of looking at that entire ecosystem and putting our money where our mouth is, both upstream and downstream.
And I mean, that is shown. So I've gotten to know, well, we all know General Motors, but they've been a member of our task force for the past 4 years. And really the leadership in moving forward and thinking outside the box, not being just reactive to what's being, asked or required of you, but thinking creatively, going right to the mine, going right to the source, investing in processing facilities, magnet facility. I think the leadership has been extraordinary in the recognition that you face an existential threat, but that you want to continue the progress of a great American company. So thank you for that. Sushan, please tell us.
Well, I'm going to go in a slightly different direction because USTR is unlike the other agencies that have been here. We don't have funds, we don't have programs to develop. We are a small policy agency. And from our perspective, when we look at the risk to global supply chains, an area that we have been focusing on is non-market policies and practices. And that is the global distortions that come from that and what those mean for the competitiveness of US industry. And that is our little niche, but it is really important because it moves out towards all the issues that have been discussed here. When we talk about supply chains, of course, as was just said in the last session, supply chains are made of companies, and our companies operate under market principles. And the supply chains that we've been talking about here and the Chinese domination of them are due to the non-market policies and practices of China, but also of some other countries. And these include things like preferential financing, debt forgiveness, below market loans, equity infusions, subsidies, export tax rebates, and all sorts of other things. And that creates an environment of not only difficult competition, but also overcapacity. And overcapacity then results in price volatility for these products. We've talked about that yesterday with regard to lithium, with regard to nickel. It also creates misallocation of resources, and that contributes also to our challenges with regard to sustainability and carbon emissions. So those two areas come together as a result of the distortive effects of the non-market policies and practices, and that's the area that we have been looking at. And one key initiative in that regard that was referenced, I think, yesterday, we've had so many conversations I've forgotten, is the work that we have been doing on the global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum, looking at how we address both non-market excess capacity and global carbon emissions through a policy portal. And it's not easy. We worked for 2 years with the EU. We're not able to come to an immediate resolution of this, but I think it has really opened up our thinking as well as elsewhere within the US government of how do you work these two streams into a policy that supports our industrial competitiveness and our supply chains, and also supports our environmental objectives. And so this is there's not a solution yet, there's not an outcome yet, but I think it's a really interesting area of policy discussion that many of the people who have been here this week have also been contributing to. And I think that is going to be a continual area of discussion, and many of our trading partners are interested in doing it with us. So we will see where that goes.
Excellent. I'm going to come back to you fairly quickly, and I'll give you sort of a heads up on what. Evan, just for a second here, I'm going to take moderator sort of privilege. Trade is an incredibly important component in this because we talk about reshoring. We don't want to just 100% domestically reshore. We can't. It doesn't make sense at all. But we can't meet the demand alone, right? For the current demand for minerals and rare earths. We need partners. We need trade agreements. We need multinational trade agreements. So I'm going to come back and ask you, yeah, I know you guys are doing some very interesting things, but you're going to lead off the second round in what authorities do you not have? what could we be doing differently? What do we need to brush off? What do we need to expand or amend to be able to enable some more partnerships? We'll park that for a second. All right, Evan.
So this is innovation we're proud of?
Yes.
Okay, so one backward-looking and then one forward-looking. So what we have done over the last 5 years in building the business is create the world's only dynamic, intelligent, shared map of the world's supply chain, kind of bottoms up. So we did this around a very unique data and technology platform that connects both public and non-public data, learns from it, renders this sort of shared, evolving view of the supply chain network, and situates all of our users in this common operating picture. So now we're in a place where the US Commerce Department, Homeland Security, DoD, the UK government, the Australian government, Netherlands government, we're about to make landfall in Singapore, and in the private sector, some of the biggest Fortune 500s, logistics providers, insurance companies, they're all now sort of connected into this shared map. And we're learning from the public, or I should say, we're learning from the commercial data and the non-classified data of those participants. So there's a real sort of visibility and learning effect underway. So that's looking backward. And now where I'm really excited is we're taking the technology and the business to a really exciting new phase, which is value chain collaboration. So not just illuminating a value chain, but giving our customers and their real-world counterparties the ability to connect and to verify and collaborate and potentially even transmit economics and other incentives through these sort of rules-based value chain networks. So that's the big North Star push for our business and our technology direction right now. And over the next, I'd say 3 months, we're going to start publicly unveiling some of these value chain collaboration, value chain network tools.
Excellent. And I will commend your vision in using technology and evolving technology to address a need. And it's a need for government to see upstream and downstream in their supply chains, to understand the environment so they can better incentivize and regulate. But it's also for companies to increase their visibility in their upstream and downstream supply chains. Sometimes they might not want to, but it's necessary and increasingly necessary to be compliant. So, and I also think what you're doing is going to be extremely helpful to help us think about how we organize a framework, so the value chain framework you referred to yesterday, and develop common standards. And I use that word very loosely because that sort of implies you have to have an enforcing body for standards. But I'm gonna talk about it in terms of common practices that we can organize around. So your leadership on that, your vision on that, it has been really extraordinary in putting technology behind it. So thank you. Sushan, I'm coming right back to you. I'm not letting you off the hook on the trade stuff.
No, and I appreciate that, and I think there are a few ways to look at your question. We have trade agreements, and they're with good trading partners, but they're bilateral or regional, and our supply chains are all over the world. And the challenges are, arguably not all contained in what we do in our FTAs. So part of what USTR did in its Federal Register notice in the hearings this week is to try and gather more information from the actors in the supply chains to understand where the challenges are now so that we can think about what we do in the future and how it addresses those particular areas. We don't have trade promotion authority, so we don't have means to negotiate trade agreements right now. And if we do get trade promotion authority from Congress at some point, it will undoubtedly include a different set or a revised set of negotiating objectives as a result of the challenges that we're facing in our supply chains. And coming back to what we are looking at in terms of potential agreements with countries or some arrangements with countries like the global arrangement to address this particular issue of non-market policies and practices, it's not something that comes up in the discussions here, but it's something that we hear about from companies that come to us, which is, you hear, these products are coming into the United States from China at below our input costs. And there's something that we've got to be able to do about that. Because when you think about all of the products that we're talking about here and the ability for those to be traded globally at below input costs for the US and our partners, there's a really critical distortion out there. And China can continue to fund that, but what happens when they can't anymore? And where does that leave us? That is an element, I think, of our supply chain security that we need to consider. How do we right those distortions so that when they're through burning money, we are in a position to have the competitive industries that we need for our supply chains. So I think that is what we're looking at now, because that's what we have the authority right now to look at. Not authority, but the ability, because we don't have the authority to do much more at this time. But it is part of the discussion we're having with trading partners, and everyone acknowledges these issues, but it's also hard to find trade policy responses to them. And that is the process we're in right now, because again, it's not just a competitiveness issue, it is a sustainability issue, especially with regard to the supply chains we're talking about here.
Yeah, I agree. And I want to thank you and your team and the department for that RFI, for that request for information, and asking industry, what do you all need? What are you seeing? How can we be helpful to you in this current environment? And I also want to thank you for recognizing we don't want to emulate what China's doing. We don't want to copy their system, but we need to figure out ways that we can be competitive. So thank you for that. But I'm going to come back to you in a second. Jasper, we've had lots of conversations about how do you further expand, how do you further increase transparency in your supply chain, how do you meet the demand, how do you source better, how do you know where you're getting your minerals? When you think about the complex challenges around all of that, what do you think you need, General Motors needs, from the government, from trading partners, from industry, to help make this more of a cohesive, forward-moving environment?
Well, there's a list. We can probably go through some of that list, but I think I'd have to say it's really interesting sitting between Sushan and Narayan. I think we have great dialogue and partnerships with the USTR, with the Department of Energy, and with many of the agencies and offices represented in this room. And I mentioned that because, going back to my point at the beginning, we are a transportation company, and we are evolving quickly, and the entire industry is evolving. What we're not is an exploration company. We are not a mining and exploration company. This has been something that I feel like we've been ahead of the pack on now for several years. But we have learned a lot along the way, but vertical integration requires you to work with partners, not just on providing access to the materials, but understanding what the risks are in certain markets, being part of the due diligence process. And I would have to say that Commerce, State, DOE, USTR have all been, USAID have all been fantastic partners in helping us kind of navigate some of these markets and better understand not just the markets, but specific projects and partners. Because at the end of the day, we're not going to trade in a concentration or a geopolitical risk for a sustainability-related risk or for another risk by going after a project in a different market. We have to understand what those risks are, and it takes our partners to do that. And I think among that kind of collaboration and due diligence has been working with agencies to understand what passes muster from the U.S. perspective, from the U.S. government perspective, and so what is good for industry to be thinking about as an offtake, particularly as an offtaker. And I would just say generally to that point, in terms of what do we need, what do we continue to need, I'd say two things. I think one, we need clarity and certainty in policy. I think the scope of what we're doing in terms of various incentives, programs, trade agreements, discussions, things like that, multilateral platforms. I think it's very important, but at the end of the day, we need long-term certainty. We need clarity as much as possible, and I think policies have an important role to play in that, but we need to know what's in and what's out, right? And I think we need collaboration with our allies, I think, and our friends. And Sushan mentioned this, and it's been a common theme, across many of the panels here. We can't do this overnight. We can't do this by ourselves. We're going to need a little help from our friends. And I would just say, from our perspective, when you look at the network of friends from a commercial perspective, they really match up well in terms of what our security allies are. The Koreas of the world, the Canadas, Australia. I think you look at that footprint and you look at that relationship map, and I think there's a lot to like there from both aspects.
Okay, I'm going to tee up Narayan in a second with the P word that you and I have talked about that you did not mention that is a need. And the P word is processing and refining capabilities. So I will tee up Narayan to talk a bit about what the department is doing there and where they need more assistance. But I want to pull on another thread because you didn't mention the P word. You talked about collaboration. Yes, we know certainty. We're all working on that. Government's working on that. But collaboration. You have talked about for a couple of years now a consortium, a regional consortium. And Sushan mentioned bilaterals. We have bilaterals, but we don't have multinational, multilateral. General Motors is doing something very interesting up in Quebec that I think could also be maybe copied, scaled in different locations. Could you just talk a little bit about that, or what you mean by a regional consortium?
Sure. On the processing side, this all ties together. From our standpoint, processing is the big gap. And we feel that is the massive domestic opportunity, really looking at that midstream battery-grade material production, looking at everything from, I had mentioned the sulfates and the hydroxides before, precursor production for cathode and anode inputs into batteries. These are the high-cost components into the highest cost component in an EV. It also happens to be easier. Well, I won't say easier is maybe the wrong word. Takes a shorter amount of time to set up a processing hub domestically than it does to open a mine, which I'm sure many folks here are familiar with. Many of the pains and challenges that are involved with doing that and the time it takes. But which brings me to my point about what's happening in Quebec. We have worked with our partners, POSCO Chemical from Korea, to set up this hub in Quebec that really looks at scaling up that midstream capability here in North America. So we have raw material inputs there. We're looking at precursor production, CAM and anode production there as well, and even leaving space to put battery recycling into there as well. So you eventually get to a closed loop system into this one hub. You do the back of the napkin math in terms of how many EVs does this potentially support? It's several 100,000, and you're probably going to need a half dozen more across North America alone to support our ecosystem of battery manufacturing and EV manufacturing here in the US and in Canada and Mexico as well. So that is a significant amount of investment in jobs on the innovation side, and a lot of that has been enabled by the Canadian government and the policies there, and I think it's a great blueprint for what can be done here as well.
So Narayan, I'm going to tee you up with that, but also the processing. And I also want to commend you, your team, but also all the different new offices in the Department of Energy, Manufacturing, Energy Supply Chain, Advanced and Applied Technologies, that have been really forward-thinking and forward-leaning. We've worked very closely with we being the task force, with your team on ways to think differently about this. But let's go back to the lack of processing and refining capability, not just domestically, but also amongst our friends. And then I want to get your thoughts on what you think about a hub like General Motors is building in Quebec.
Yeah, I think this is definitely the most important part of the value chain to be talking about, in part because it's the part of the value chain which we could probably tackle most quickly. It's also the most vulnerable part. And that's very much reflected in the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act and the tools given to the U.S. government under them. I mentioned the $6 billion battery material processing and manufacturing grants. That is a massive program, along with the 48C investment tax credit, which also helps fund critical materials processing as well. So we are going all in on material processing right now in the U.S., and the Department of Energy is very much through both LPO loans and MESC grants doing that. Now, we do recognize that the processors are kind of caught in a pretty difficult situation. They're on one side dealing with price volatility on the commodity side. So we are seeing new entrants deterred from coming in because they don't know what the price of lithium or nickel is going to be next year, right? And building a business model is going to be hard with commodity super cycles and whatnot. On the other side, they need off-takers. And the qualification process to be able to get an OEM as an off-taker, that takes time as well. So they're kind of caught in between, and this is where government can really help. We can help. I mean, the grants and loans we're putting out are definitely de-risking these projects, giving them a little bit more lead time. We're trying to bring the national labs in to help them demonstrate and work with them on some of the qualification processes that they need to go through. But speaking of RFIs, the price volatility issue we think is really important, which is why just a couple of weeks ago, the Manufacturing and Energy Supply Chain Office put out a request for information specifically asking the industry, what can we do to better address the price volatility issue in critical mineral commodity markets, and how can we help create some semblance of market stability, if at all, here. Among the questions we tee up are what are better multilateral forums or ways in which we can tackle this problem, or working with industry, is there a way to build consortia to kind of better coordinate on this issue? Are there other tools that the department should be looking at in terms of price backstopping and contracts for differences and whatnot? So there's many different options on the table, and I will also say it's not a one-size-fits-all. I think you actually have to look mineral by mineral. Every single mineral has a different supply chain, has different countries that are involved, and we're less vulnerable in some places and we're more vulnerable in others. So we have to recognize that as well. So we teed that up in the request for information. So to answer your question quickly, this is front of mind. We're putting money into the processing sector right now, and recognizing that in order to make sure that they're durably in the game, we have to address through trade policy and whatnot, we have to address the volatility issue for sure, and the dumping concerns as well.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there. I mean, and I could sit here all weekend and talk about that, but nobody's interested in that. We have 9 minutes left, and I want to give each of you sort of a last, like a lightning round to talk about something. But I'll go back to a little bit more of a dark cloud, sticking with the theme today. And to use another pun, we have the chips stacked against us to dig out of our hole. Okay, come on, people, it's early, right? But we do, right? And China is working every angle they can, even down to, in the cybersecurity space, the social media platforms, in launching fake protests to stop mines, to gin up environmental concern, indigenous population concern about new mines being built. So as we continue to try to move forward and take steps forward, we will continue to have this pushback. So to set up sort of the last lightning round, it will take a whole of government, but back to, Evan, what you said yesterday, it's taking a whole of nation approach. It is really thinking about this in a new way, in a new paradigm, in a new framework. And I'm going to give you the last word, Evan, because I think the way you summed it up yesterday, even if you just repeat that, and how we need to think about modernizing and revolutionizing not just our supply chains, but the way we think about all of our manufacturing and advanced technologies. With that being said, Narayan, what do you think the department can do to continue assisting this Herculean effort in what is actually a politically toxic environment? And trust me, I'm acutely aware of that right now. But again, chips are stacked against us. You're trying to do the right thing. Your team is. We know that. What is something else you think you could and should be doing?
So I might flip it a little bit and provide a little bit more optimism on this. I think this is definitely one of the areas in which there's a lot of bipartisan consensus on tackling this issue, specifically critical minerals and supply chains at large. I think U.S. federal government can do a much better job of listening to industry. We're doing that, but that's a work in progress of actually really understanding how we pick our spots. And the mantra at DOE is very much that the clean energy transition has to be private sector led, government enabled. So we are very much trying to figure out exactly what the most vulnerable parts of the supply chain are, where DOE can either provide grant or loan support or use our convening powers as the federal government to try to fix some of the market failures where they exist. I think tools like what Evan is building are going to be very, very important. It helps government, it helps industry, it could help potentially provide some price transparency down the line. That's something, in many of these sectors, the notion of price transparency just didn't exist many years ago, because these are a lot of clouded by bilateral contracts that they're not really necessarily traded on exchanges or whatnot. So that is something that I think as we kind of open up, this conversation of traceability and all that, I think increasingly government has a role to play in helping enable the tools to trace things. The last thing I'll say is I think we just need a little bit more time. We should be impatient on this issue, but we also should let the investments that we're making play out a little bit. And on the other side, going back to the last panel, we are actively investing in alternative technologies. Our Office of Science is investing in alternative battery chemistries. ARPA-E is constantly investing in the next generation of batteries like sodium-ion batteries and whatnot. So I think it's really all of the above, but we can coordinate better. We can listen to industry more. But I also think we need to lend a little bit of caution and encourage people to be a little patient.
I agree with that. As much as we're saying, it's the world on the brink and we have a lot to do, we do have to be patient. This is not going to be a flip the light switch, transition at all. We can't just all of a sudden have 300 operational mines to meet our demand of 2030. So that is something yes, we do. There are things we can do now. There are things we can put in place for the next few years. So I think that's very good advice. Jasper.
Because my final thought would be really thinking about industrial policy more along the lines as a vanguard for American industry. I'd say think about it as not just incentives and support targeting things like processing, and which is a critical need going forward in this value chain, but thinking about, to Narayan's point, how can we think about public-private partnership and dialogue to look at deal-making structures in this space, to see what kind of appetite is there for shared risk, shared funding and investment into various projects, being part of the due diligence process going forward, and working on trade policies that create market access. But I would just say not just for the commodities, not just for the minerals and the materials that we need, but we also have to think about the equipment, the tooling, the workforce, the technology and the IP, so that we can start thinking about how we take advantage of some of the great programs at DOE and target those funds in the right space. So really kind of looking at that more expansively and more creatively in terms of that partnership.
Yeah, thank you. And just as we're not going to be able to have 300 operational mines tomorrow, we are not going to have a highly skilled, advanced workforce today or tomorrow unless we start doing something today. Teeing up Sushan, really well done on the trade policy. It's a whole of nation approach, but it's also a whole of like-minded countries approach. So, Sushan.
Yes, and I think when you talk to other governments and industries in other countries, they all acknowledge the situation that we're facing. The challenge is getting them to step up to work with us collaboratively, because in order to create the market-oriented global market that we need for these technologies to succeed, we need to have a counter market to what China is doing. And we can't do it alone. Our market is big, but it's not big enough. And we have to find ways to use our trade instruments, our trade policies, and the encouragement, hopefully, of our business communities and their counterparts in these countries to help their governments make that step to ally with us on these projects. I think that is the challenge we're facing now. And I think the work on the global arrangement on steel and aluminum indicated that you can go so far, but there's still it's a political challenge to take that next step. And I think a lot of the conversation that's been happening here could well inform our partners in understanding what the global picture looks like so that we can find solutions together, because we have to all implement this together. Us doing it alone is not going to be enough.
Excellent, thank you. Concur wholeheartedly. Evan.
So over the last 2 days, whether it was on the embedded carbon topic or DoD procurement and chip security, we talked about some of the financial engineering associated with building sort of trust premia into a value chain. So I want to actually sort of summarize and bring those concepts together around the idea that there can and should be a framework for communicating an incentive through a trusted value chain. And those incentives can be around resilience, around carbon, around security. It can be all the things we're discussing here today. But especially to address what you're describing as these sort of non-market activities that are flooding the zone and in critical mineral processing in particular, but other parts of the economy. You need some incentive structure beyond just market access barriers. You need to be able to reward GM and give them the toolkit to transmit an incentive structure down the value chain to the participants that are doing the right thing and being part of these trusted value chains. So the lawyers would have to figure that out, but I think the conceptual framework would be how do you as a nation or a collection of nations say these are the values, these are the sort of security or resilience dimensions that we care about, and we're going to allow for whether it's tax credits or some border adjustment or sort of figure out the details, but the framework should be how do you communicate these incentive structures down and through and across these value chain networks and enable them to reach the parts of the value chain that address these fundamental issues.
Yes, agree. And to address the single point of failure, which is China having such control as it does, we need to do that. It is an existential threat. It is not about our dominance, but it is about maintaining our economic freedoms, our economic structure. It's about resiliency and security. I take that one step further. It's about flexibility and endurance. To summarize a bit, first, I want to thank you all for your participation, for your leadership, and continuing to step forward in a very difficult environment with a lot of headwinds. It is a world on the brink. We are all coming together to make certain we continue to step forward. Our supply chain task force, working hand in hand in partnership with the Silverado Policy Accelerator, will be releasing recommendations on some of these things, incentives. How do you incent companies to actually comply? How do you incent companies to look from a compliant sourcing pool? Can we set up a Department of Defense sourcing pool for the defense industrial base? A lot of these different recommendations and solutions we're talking about, we're trying to put some teeth on them to make them a little bit granular when they come forward, so they're easily implementable, and we can actually continue forward. And those are going to be focused actually on critical minerals and rare earths, but we're actually talking about the entire value chain and working with our partners, like-minded allied partners. So thank you for your leadership. Thank you, Maureen and Dimitri and Sarah again. And keep up the good fight. We have to continue harnessing our American ingenuity. I'm channeling my husband. He would be so proud. I'm being optimistic here. I think we can do it. I know we can do it. That's why you guys are all here. So thank you very much for indulging us today.